Okay, welcome back. And tonight I'm going to be lecturing on the kind of the art impulse for Unit 6 on whoop on whether on art and power, the relationship between art and the political world. And this is the final lecture of Unit 6, and I took a while to get to it because all the other lectures were kind of more important from the point of view of helping you study for the midterm for and also getting ready for the paper. So that's why there was such a kind of an odd order to these. Okay. So in this lecture, we're going to be kind of talking about the relationship between art and power. And one of the first things that we need to understand is that for most of history of humanity, not talking about prehistory, but like from the start of civilization onward, very definitely. Art has been always tied to state and religious power, and usually state and religious power are combined, and art is a servant of those things. And it's the tradition of art a as a protester, as a critiquer of power, and critiquer of the status quo is a much more recent tradition. But as we're looking through this history, we can see glimpses of that even in older periods. And that's why we're going to start with the dying lioness. So, if you remember, the dying lioness was part of a much larger set of reliefs in which it was Ashurbanipal lion hunting. And this was an important political statement because to hunt lions was the prerogative and the responsibility of kings, right? And so by being the lion hunter, Ashurbanipal was, kind of arguing that he was the king of kings, which is a title that the Assyrians came up with first. And and so the dying lioness is just part of that much larger complex where on one set of walls we're seeing Ashurbanipal hunt lions. On the other set of walls, we're seeing Ashurbanipal defeating his enemies in battle. And they're both trying to establish the idea that Ashurbanipal is powerful. Ashurbanipal is, you know, the force of the divine on earth, and that he's a really mean, awful being. So don't mess with him. And and so in a way, we could interpret this little slice out of this just that way, that it is just about cruelty, it's just about the pain, and it's not about in any way anything more humane or sympathetic. And yet, when we look at this image, it's hard not to see this as a sympathetic and an empathetic image. It's hard not to feel like the artists sympathized more with the lioness than they did with the King of Kings who was killing the lions. And one thing to keep in mind is that the workforce for the Assyrians was predominantly slaves. That the Assyrians, one of the things that they did as part of their empire building was that they had a concerted effort of moving large populations of people. This is why in the Bible, the northern kingdom of Israel is pretty much wiped out, right? Leaving only Judea because the Assyrians conquer and they take everyone, all of the elite, they take all of the craftsmen. And generally, they just take large parts of the population and then they just move them to other places. This is the same reason why the Soviets did this, just moving people off to other other parts, because when you're a stranger in a strange land, it's a lot harder for you to resist. And and you're also much more dependent on the state, even if you still resent the state. So they just moved large populations of people all over the empire to different parts for their purposes, and and this was all part of their effort to kind of like demoralize you know and to just eliminate whole ethnic groups. Um, the the fact that the Judeans survived and that we have the Bible is an amazing fact because there are thousands and thousands of other ethnic groups that would have been in the Assyrian Empire that did not survive, that this kind of activity just eliminated. So it's quite possible because of that, that these craftsmen were not themselves Assyrian and were not super sympathetic to the Assyrian Empire or to Ashurbanipal himself. And so it is possible that maybe they brought a little bit of that feeling of sympathy to this dying lioness. But it is also possible that there is none of that in the work of art created, that that is all entirely us reading into it. And we have to accept the possibility that we can never know, right? That to a certain degree, The Dying Lioness is as much a 20th century work of art, or I guess 19th century. I don't know the exact date it was discovered, but it's a modern work of art as much as it is an ancient work of art. And what I mean by that is that when we discovered it, we became a new audience for it with almost no training as to how to see it compared to the original people that it was made for. And so we see it, we did see it when it was uncovered, and we continue to see it in an entirely new modern light, right? We look at it and we see sympathy, and that might be there, but maybe for the creators, it wasn't there. It definitely wasn't there for the people who commissioned this work. So we need to be skeptical and but we also need to be open to the possibility that art is not always serving power. Yeah, if you're not paying close enough attention, look at how Ashurbanipal here, right? I mean, how he's stabbing the lion, but he's also grabbing the lion. And this is a giant animal, right? It's grabbing this lion by the neck, right? One-handed. Um, and of course, no human really could do this because a lion outweighs a human significantly, but it makes good art. So here's another case in point, another bit of a mystery of like, what did they mean by this? So Pergamon was a city, a Greek city in what is now today Turkey, part of one of these Hellenistic kingdoms that were founded after the death of Alexander. And Pergamon was actually kind of an unusual one because most of these kingdoms were kind of rather large and covered large areas and multiple cities. But Pergamon was primarily a single city and its region and the area around it. And um, and Pergamon was one of these cities that was at the most vulnerable to the influx of Gauls into Greece and into Thrace and into Asia Minor, or what today we would call Turkey. And the Gauls were just coming in great numbers, and everyone was afraid of how to defeat the Gauls. And in a heroic battle near Pergames, along with their allies, defeated the Gauls and pushed them back, and the Gauls retreated. And in honor of that victory, they built the altar to Zeus that we saw earlier, and they also built this cycle of sculptures, right? But interestingly enough, the sculpture is entirely of the enemies, the people they defeated, right? It's entirely of the Gauls. And the Gauls are actually portrayed as being somewhat heroic, right? They're like here we have um, a Gaul couple where the woman has already stabbed herself and has committed suicide, and the husband, the man, is about to do the same. And notice he's about to stab himself with this sort of like gladius-like sword, like in the top of his chest, like to the heart, not like, from below, like going underneath the thoracic arch, which would be so it's like that's a that's not an easy way to stab yourself to death. And here is a Gaulish archer who looks like he's about to be defeated, and here's a Gaul who is in the moment dying, right? And the strange thing about these images is like, why? were the Pergamese to celebrate their victory. Why would they make these images that seem like they kind of celebrate the virtue and the valor of of the Gauls, of the people that they defeated and who were their enemies? And you could look at it as an act of sympathy, but another explanation could be that they felt like by emphasizing how amazingly heroic these Gauls were, that really represents how amazing the victory was. Like if we could defeat these kind of superhuman guys who are willing to die all the way and willing to kill themselves and their wives right up into the point of capture, if we can defeat them, then we must be really powerful. So once again, it's a little bit unclear why. So, like I said, in most of the history of art, art is serving power. Art is just doing the job of saying the powerful are powerful for good reason. And make sure to stay, stay on your knees, stay down, and give all the power to them. But through the whole history of art, we have glimpses of other ways of looking at the world. And so we see some artists who are looking at the less fortunate, looking at people who are on the outside of society, on the very outskirts, the very marginalized. So, like I mentioned before, in the Alexandrian Hellenistic school of sculpture, there was a lot more emphasis on kind of looking at everyday life. And this particular motif of a beggar woman, of an old beggar woman, was a very popular motif among the Alexandrian Hellenistic sculptors. And once again, we don't really know exactly what it means, like why. It could be like just literally like a sense of like, isn't that horrible that this woman is living this existence? It could be an expression of outrage, an expression of sympathy, but it could have other meanings that are just unclear to us. Whereas here with Daumier, don't know why that came down again. Here with Daumier, we have a print. This is a lithograph, and this much more is a an expression of horror, right? This is a an image of after essentially a massacre. There was a riot, right? And the riot was in the streets, but it basically, as soon as like the cops arrived and everything, the riot spread through these apartment buildings. And so people literally died in their beds as rioters were smashing through different areas. And so here we have an entire dead family, an old man, what looks probably to be the wife, and here's the husband, and underneath him is a baby. It's pretty gruesome. And so Daumier was making artwork like this to kind of basically say, see, look at what's going on here in what's supposed to be this beautiful city, and yet, horrific things like this happen. So looking at just everyday normal people is not that common in the history of art. And it has frequently been something of a radical idea. Let's start with Caravaggio. So Caravaggio, um, for a lot of these paintings, he hired people who were the thing about Caravaggio was that partially because he was a great drinker and a carouser, he spent a lot of his life living with people of much lower class. Um, and so and those were the people he had available to him as models. So when he would make these scenes from the Bible, he would use people of very low class, the poor, and some of his contemporaries criticized him for it, and but Caravaggio was well educated and he could read, and he said, I've read the New Testament, and I know that all through the New Testament, most of the people that Jesus is talking to are poor people. Courbet, much later, is also very much interested in looking at what the working poor, the serf class, the lower class of society, what they were doing and trying to get Parisian society, the upper class, to actually see. This is called Stonebreakers, and it's a um, so um, in France at this time, right, they would have roads for the carriages, but the roads would frequently need to be repaired because when you run carriages over roads, you get holes and so forth in the dirt. And so someone would need to come along and break up stones and then lay out like basically gravel, and it's backbreaking work. And what the French would do is they'd have these big work crews, but they would basically, as they were going down the road, they would just go to all the nearby villages and grab people and just say, "You're working for us for the next 2 weeks." And for those 2 weeks, these farmers couldn't do any of their normal work, right? They were just required to, you know, break stones all day in order to make the roads for France. Here's another example of an artist who um, kind of pushed the boundaries by having things be more everyday. So um, Veronese, when he painted this painting, right, it is Feast in the House of Levi. But this painting originally was going to be um, the Last Supper. And so he was painting it as a commission to be the Last Supper. But as he was working on it, he was adding little details. He was adding different kinds of people. Like there's a dog right there. There are German soldiers. There are other people. There's, I believe, a dwarf, a person of small stature. And there are um, all kinds of just, odd bits and pieces of different people and slice of life stuff going on, right? And so after he painted it, and he painted it for a monastery, and the monks loved it. They thought it was great. But then the Spanish Inquisition heard about it, and they sent out a team to look at the painting, and they thought it was blasphemous to have all of this different kind of detail, all these little slices of life in this painting that was supposed to be the Last Supper. And they brought him to trial. They brought Veronese to trial, and they wanted to get to the bottom of this, wanted to punish someone. And in the end, Veronese capitulated. And what he did was he changed the title of the painting. He said, "Fine, it's the Feast in the House of Levi, still a scene from the New Testament, but it's not the Last Supper." So it was acceptable for it to have all of this variety in everyday life. So another point that I've kind of made in multiple lectures, but want to make again, is that sometimes narrative, right? Sometimes ideas, sometimes imagery, a sense of representation, even when an artist is trying to avoid those things happen anyway. This particular painting by Malevich is titled Red Square, Black Square. And because of the fact that this painting was painted post the Russian Revolution, and the fact that Red Square is an actual location, and the fact that there were in Russia immediately after the revolution there was a civil war. Civil war was between various factions, including one faction that called themselves the Reds. Those are the communists. One faction that called themselves the Whites, that were the people loyal uh, to the royal family. What were they called again? The czars, right? Um, and then one group called themselves the blacks, and that was the anarchists, the who were not the most powerful by any means. Um, and anyway, so because of that, it's hard not to look at that and think that it's some kind of political statement. So art trying to make political statements. So let's look at the case of David, um, because David's art was pretty much political for almost all of his life. But here we have two paintings, one at the start of his career and one a little bit further along in his career. And in the Oath of the Horatii, um, he is he's making a painting using so very obliquely making an allegory, right? To to argue for a change in politics. So this is a story from Roman history where um, actually, it's probably Greek. Anyway, with the word Horatii. Um, now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, it's a story from antiquity. And in this story, the father is asking the sons to pledge their loyalty to freedom, right? And they pledge their loyalty and they say, yes, we will fight. And um, and so this was used, people talked about this as a painting that was talking about true virtue and the importance of liberty, right? And in a time when the the French monarchy was about to fall, right? So it was interpreted by people as basically being pro-revolution. Come to the death of Marat, right? This is after the revolution. We're in the aftermath where now various leaders of the revolution are being assassinated by other leaders of the revolution. And this painting, The Death of Marat, is about one of the leaders of the revolution who had just been stabbed to death um, in his bath while he was writing letters. And so it's no longer allegory, right? It is just simply a statement of fact. It is a political message without any subterfuge, without hiding any subtext. Okay, so more protest art. I promised that multiple times that I would talk about the Raft of the Medusa. We've talked about it in a lot of different ways. We've talked about it in terms of composition. We've talked about it in terms of shapes and in terms of value organization. But now I'll tell you a little bit about the story behind the Raft of the Medusa. So the Medusa was a French ship and was a merchant ship, right? And it was on a course going around the coast of Africa, and um, and it was going to be delivering and picking up trade goods. And the ship began to fail. It was beginning to sink. And when it started to sink, all of the all of the elite who were on the ship, all the wealthy, they all got into the the boats, the boats you have to get off of what there's a name for that. And there were not nearly enough for the whole crew. And so the rest of the crew was left to just fend for themselves. And they literally, like all these poor people who were just left on this sinking ship, they literally tore the ship apart and built rafts, primarily one large raft, um, out of the ship to survive. And then they stayed on that raft and they were out there for weeks, um, barely surviving until they were finally rescued. And this was a huge story in in France. It was a huge scandal, and it was a political scandal partially because of the fact of like how the the powerful and the rich were allowed all the people who were not to basically just die on this ship. And it was also a huge story because it was a scandal because the ship, turns out, was actually involved in the slave trade, even though France had already um, was already an abolitionist country, right? It already said we do not believe in slavery, right? And so, but they were kind of like keeping a blind eye to the fact that some French traders, some French merchants were still still participating in the slave trade. So that was part of it. And so anyway, then here's Jericho. He's making the painting that's representing that moment where they finally get rescued. Over here, we have, and to a degree, by making this painting, it is a statement of protest. It's like it took him 2 years to paint it, and the event happened like a year or so before that. So 3 years after the event, he produces this painting, and it's this reminder to everyone, yes, we can't forget. Liberty leading the people is a more direct reaction to protest in the streets. Um, there were a number of revolutions in France through the 19th century. It was not simply just the French Revolution, but there were a number of kind of protests and revolutions that occurred in Europe. 48, I think, 1830, and Delacroix wanted to make this painting in honor of um, those that were those were that were rioting in the streets and those that were fighting for liberty. And so he made this image of the symbolic figure of liberty herself, right? Leading literally the people in a street revolution. Okay, so there are other ways to make art that protests. Goya, who is a Spanish artist, and it's interesting because we see a lot of Spanish art, and we primarily see a lot of the art that we see comes from the two main civil wars of Spain. So Francisco Goya lived through a series of wars in Spain, and and during this time period where he wasn't able to work as a court painter, he made a lot of prints, and the prints were a lot of them he made were called the disasters of war, and they were like scenes of things that he had seen, like just bodies strung up, and he's just kind of like remarking and kind of showing us what horrible things were happening. Um, and then Jake Dinos Chapman, artists who, in general, I don't respect a lot, but at least they had good taste in terms of who they wanted to copy here. So they made a sculpture piece based off of the Goya piece. And so as we move into the 20th century, we get a lot more statements of opposition to power and a lot more kind of anti-war statements, but they're kind of all over the map. We have like these very emotional statements like Guernica. We have these kind of poetic statements that are hard to read, hard to figure out. And then we have these kind of ironic statements like Roy Lichtenstein, where is he protesting the war? Is he celebrating? Is he just mocking everything? So in terms of, I do apologize if you can hear Max whining in the background. That's one of my dogs. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about Gerhard Richter and Anselm Kiefer in terms of how artists have to, sometimes it's impossible for artists to ignore the political. Like for a lot of artists, for, American artists in the 60s, it was easy to, if you wanted to avoid political art entirely. But for German artists post World War II, it was kind of impossible. Um, Richter grew up in East Germany, and so Kiefer grew up in West Germany, but in the aftermath of of Nazi rule and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and both of them really could not. They can't shake that past. That past is runs through their work completely. And so as we're wrapping it up, getting towards the end, we're looking at more contemporary artwork. We can see a lot of political artwork that is kind of critical of being political and kind of skeptical in general, and has a more ironic and acerbic sort of approach. A good example of that would be Ai Weiwei's piece Sunflower Seeds, where if if you don't remember, I've talked about this piece before, but like um when he does an installation of this piece, he fills a hall, right? And this is at the Tate Modern. He fills a hall, and in this case, it's a huge space entirely filled with sunflower seeds. Only as you walk across it, you realize you can kind of feel it and hear it, and from the dust, you can figure out that these are not actual sunflower seeds. Every single one of these sunflower seeds is a hand painted piece of porcelain. Each one is made out of porcelain. It's a porcelain sunflower seed, hand painted. And it's a beautiful, amazing work. He hired a village to help him make it. He had to employ them for like 5 years, I think, to make, millions and millions of sunflower seeds in order to make these kind of installations. And it is, in a way, a critique of China and a critique of power, and definitely a critique of Mao and the old China. But it's also kind of kind of cryptic, a little bit hard to figure out exactly what Ai Weiwei is saying. And here's another kind of contemporary case. Um, I think in contemporary art, political is often more about kind of subverting expectations and getting you to think in new ways. And so Kehinde Wiley's work, one of the things he likes to do is he likes to take these compositions of famous Western paintings, like from famous Baroque and like 17th century and 18th century paintings, and especially paintings that are of very rich and powerful people, like um, lords, dukes, kings, emperors, and then to repopulate them, repaint them in a way with colors that are more, you know, very modern, very contemporary, and to paint them with people that are everyday people from either from his life originally, but then also he's done a lot of traveling where he goes around. He's very much interested in kind of like the African diaspora all over the world, like so going to communities like in Jamaica or going to the Dominican Republic or going to Brazil and meeting people and kind of getting a sense of what as an African American man, right? A a man in America who is African American, but who was originally from Africa. He's very much interested in that kind of like in that community, that worldwide community, and all the commonalities. So, and then here's the last piece I'm going to talk about tonight, which is yet another Jenny Holzer. And I think that this is of all the political statements, this is probably in art one of the most powerful. And I just think that Jenny Holtz's work is so incredibly smart and clever. And so, yeah, that's where we're going to end. And we're going to stop share and end it. Everyone have a good night. Have a great weekend.